I speak tonight for the dignity of man and the destiny of democracy.
I urge every American of all religions and of all colors from every section of this country to join me in that cause. At times, history and fate meet at a single time in a single place to shape a turning point in man's unending search for freedom. Long-suffering men and women peacefully protested the denial of their rights as Americans. For the cries of pain and the hymns and protest of oppressed people have summoned into convocation all the majesty of this great government. In our time, we have come to live with moments of great crisis. Our mission is at once the oldest and the most basic of this country. To right wrong, to do justice, to serve man. There is no Southern problem. There is no Northern problem. There is only an American problem. We are met here as Americans to solve that problem.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome President and CEO of the LBJ Foundation, Mark K. Updegrove.
Welcome back to the Summit on Race in America. We have another great afternoon ahead. We'll begin with Anatomy of an Ad, an exploration of the advertising industry's trend toward diversity. Contributing to that discussion will be Karrelle Dixon, the Managing Director of Wieden+Kennedy, Adweek's 2018 Agency of the Year, Patty Orlando, the Creative Director of Wieden+Kennedy Portland, and Glenn Singleton, the founder of Courageous Conversation. We heard from Glenn yesterday as he talked about the illusion of color blindness. Javier Zamora, the award-winning poet and activist, will follow with the reading of his work. He'll then join in a conversation on the complex issue of immigration, which will be led by Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, professor at the LBJ School of Public Affairs and an MSNBC contributor. Also participating in that discussion will be Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and Emmy-nominated filmmaker Jose Antonio Vargas, president of MALDEF, Thomas Science, and professor of public policy practice at the LBJ School of Public Affairs, Ruth Wasson. After that, Dulce Sloan, correspondent for The Daily Show, will do a stand-up comedy performance. And if you saw Dulce on the panel yesterday, you want to stay in your seats for that performance? You might be on the edge of those seats for that performance. And finally, we'll conclude the afternoon with a conversation about race and the media with Yamiche Alcindor, the White House correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and Kathleen McElroy, the director of the School of Journalism here at the University of Texas and the former associate managing editor of the New York Times. In the interest of dismantling long-standing racial barriers in the city of Austin, Mayor Steve Adler put together a task force on institutional racism and systemic inequities, charged with developing a set of recommendations impacting 5 core areas of civic life: education, civil and criminal justice, real estate and housing, finance, banking and industry, and health and wellness. And here to talk about that task force is the mayor himself. Please welcome the Honorable Mayor Steve Adler.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to come in and say hello. This is a phenomenal several days. The LBJ Foundation, the LBJ Library, such incredible resource for us in the community, and no more important topic could someone be dealing with, especially for a city like Austin, Texas. A city where so many things are going so well. Always nice to have the U.S. News and World Report rank Austin #1 yet again. But it is probably because things are going so well that the things that are not stand out in such incredible relief. And that's what we're dealing with in our city. And in so many ways, race is the defining issue with respect to the things that challenge us most in this city, which are really about opportunity and access. That's what affordability is tied to in our city. In a lot of ways, it's what mobility is tied to in our city. You know, several years ago, we had a shooting where a naked 17-year-old child was killed on our streets in an incident with the police. The reaction that our city historically has had is to gather people together for a meaningful conversation, but at some point having yet another meaningful conversation seems grossly inappropriate to the magnitude of the moment or the issues at hand. So instead of that, we looked at what President Obama had done with community policing, and we created this task force on institutional racism and systemic inequities, recognizing that the same issues that were at the forefront in this city in 1928 when we adopted a land plan that sent different people of different colors to different parts of the city. Not something we can just blame on happening 100 years ago, because in the 1950s, our city council and community doubled down on that land plan yet again. But in our city, recognizing that those issues, not only criminal justice, but also access to capital and housing and healthcare delivery, so many of the issues. So we formed that task force. And the most startling thing to me was that when we initiated that conversation after that incident, and we broke it into those areas saying we wanted specific things we could do, not a restatement of the problem, specific things that we could do as a community, which resulted in 252 recommendations, 60 of which have been implemented and 90 are underway. When we formed that, and I first started talking to people about it, the number of people that said to me, I love this idea, this is great, I want to be involved. But can you call it something else? And I said, what do you mean? And they said, institutional racism, that's incendiary. It's going to make everybody think that we're calling each other racists in our city. You're going to get more people to cooperate. Can you just call it something else? Which shows you just how important it is that we call things by their name. I'm really excited for the several days that you've had, for the rest of the afternoon that's coming in. It is about time that in more and more places we are calling institutional racism and racism generally exactly what it is in really unambiguous language. Enjoy the rest of the afternoon. Enjoy the city.
Please welcome Wieden+Kennedy's Managing Director, Karrelle Dixon, Portland Office Creative Director, Patty Orlando, and the author and creator of Courageous Conversation, Glenn Singleton.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
It's great to be back. Wow. Before I start, I just want to put a pin in something that the Honorable Vernon Jordan said this morning. He spoke of the urgency for the moment, hope for the future, and responsibility to one another. And it pierced me because I couldn't think of a better way of talking about some really innovative work that's happened with Patty and Karrelle. And so our work is necessarily personal. Many people in my life don't even know that I began my professional career in advertising in 1982 in New York City. And I was put on the most racialized accounts, I believe, possible. The US Army, recruiting people who looked like me to enlist, and also the war on drugs, which was the account for Ronald Reagan at NWA. And through that, it pushed me out of advertising in just over a year. So it was quite the moment to be in New York City and to have to run out so quickly. But it was something that really served as a real foundation for my diversity, equity, and inclusion work, and as a diversity, equity, inclusion educator. And there were some important tenets that I brought to the work at that point, 3 in fact. The most important was that our work, our human work, our transformation work is necessarily personal first. The second is that race matters, and the first step to acknowledging that is to begin to effectively talk about racism. And the third is that our personal beliefs drive our professional behaviors, which yield our organizational results. And so with those 3 ideas, 5 years ago, I met an incredible visionary. His name is Dan Wieden. And as I sat in his office, he said, you know, there is just something that we haven't gotten to in advertising, and I'm hopeful that through our partnership, we can get there. How do we make it so that all people can bring their whole selves to work? And how can we create greater diversity in an industry that has been traditionally white since its inception? And as Dan spoke to me about this, I was just shocked, and I said, I want to work with that guy. And so what we're going to do is we're going to begin with introducing you to Dan.
I ended up asking myself a very serious question. I said, Wieden, what do you really, really care about? What's really driving you nuts? And if you could change one thing before you check out of this world, what would it be? And that was actually a pretty simple answer. And this issue continues to gnaw on me because, like it or not, in this business, I essentially hire a bunch of white, middle-class kids, pay them enormous sums of money to do what? To create messages to the inner city, to kids who create the culture the white kids are trying the hell to emulate. But if you go into the inner city, odds are these kids aren't even going to see advertising as a possibility, as an opportunity for them. And now that's f***ed up. I mean, it is, I'm sorry, but don't get me wrong. Now, I'm not bringing this up today because I think Wieden+Kennedy is doing this phenomenal goddamn job of rectifying the situation. I think we've made some progress, but we've got miles and miles to go before we sleep.
So that was Dan back in 2006 with a very clear message of how are we going to evolve. Now, I'm from the UK, so I moved to Portland, Oregon, one of the whitest cities in America, apparently. and you're supposed to represent global brands and have an insight into the cultures and behaviors that happen in America. And so as we started to lead this change and do this work with Glenn, it became incredibly important both for me personally as to how the face of the agency was going to change. I was told when I first started in the industry that I couldn't be the face of an agency. You wouldn't be someone that would represent this. So it became an incredible mission for both myself and the organization as we looked to see how the org would evolve. And the first thing was just representation. So you'll start to see that previous poster was, or image was from our affinity group of We Black, so the African-American Black individuals within the agency. And then as part of the work, we felt like it needed to have the agency was huge. It's 500-600 people. So how do we make sure that people feel like they have a brave space, how they feel like they connect with like-minded people. They understand some of the burdens and strains that people face as you go around your daily life. So we created affinity groups, and these kind of represent the different groups that we have within the agency. And again, it's a whole, but we're always conscious of how we move this conversation forward, whether it be the We Black group or the 51%, which represents the females and women in the agency, the WK Gay Club, the Latinx Alliance. And again, this is just a part of making people come to work as part of their whole self, to be able to show up and feel comfortable in that environment. But that doesn't have, as you try to make these kind of changes, the industry forces are against us. It is a huge challenge. You have these competing, at times, ideologies of like, how do you think about things responsibly? How do you look at an agency and make sure that you've got the right representation whilst making sure you've got the balance as you think through the different developments? How do we think about the talent? And you often hear the conversations when at a creative director level of, well, I just can't find the talent. I just don't know if it's out there. Like, or all of a sudden, I've got tons of people, but I have no roles for them in the agency. We have to be financially responsible. So as we started to think about that, we have all of these conversations and forces pushing on the agency. And if you go to the next one. So the question becomes pretty simple. So how do you drive social justice and think through that, racial justice and social change? How do you think through that? What do we do? How do we show up? How do we make sure those things really deliver? And the way that we started that is to really think about planning. Like, courage takes planning. It can't be reactive. It has to be something that you really are intentional about. So as an organization, we started to be very intentional about the behaviors and the approaches that we were going to take to move the ball forward. One of those that we often talk about is just from an agency standpoint, when we tell stories, and we like to think of ourselves as storytellers, is this combination of what is a brand truth? And we like to dig around in our clients' archives and in their attic to really understand the brand essence of who they are, why they show up to work, why they come to work in a way that believes in the organization, but also how we marry that with the human truth that is happening in culture and what that says about them. So really thinking about that sweet spot of the brand truth and what the brand represents, both to individuals out there in the world and to the individuals that work for the organization. And then this very real human truth as to how you should show up and what's happening in culture.
So one of the most important pieces of making authentic, relatable, important work that will move the needle forward is in representation, and representation matters. It's important that we reflect the culture that we live in, the diversity of the culture that we live in. And that's not only in the work that we make and in the way we portray people in our work, but also in who creates the work, who approves the work, and in our agency. So one spot that shows this is Coca-Cola, Super Bowl spot from 2014. Has a spot called It's Beautiful. We'll share that with you. But basically, Coke has always prided itself on bringing people together, families and friends. And Coke is also a very democratic drink. Everyone drinks it from all walks of life. And so with this film, Coke wanted to paint a picture of like the true fabric of the diversity in American culture. So let's take a look.
Oh, beautiful for space. gracious skies. Por tus olas de grano sambar. Yo piscina sakote. Sa ibabaw ng mga prutas. America, America, God shed His grace on thee. Orba hijre ke saath aaj tera cha. La mer brilla. Berat tu verrière tirotard. From sea to shining sea.
So, as Patty kind of talked about, it shows the true fabric of America, but that's not an easy film and commercial to put out into the world. It can often be a challenge, especially on the biggest spotlight that is the Super Bowl. So it took a lot of courage for that organization to say, hey, we are going to do this. Why and what are the benefits of it? Well, we're truly representing the consumers that we have in the world, and certainly in America. It had a huge impact. It grew their business. It was a cultural conversation, a bit of a lightning rod that literally we had the trolls that very quickly from a Twitter standpoint were straight away talking about the brand in a negative light, to be honest. But then we also had a huge amount of upsurge in, I believe in this brand. I believe in what it stands for. And I connect that brand and its truth with what I believe in. So Coca-Cola saw spikes in North America of growth from a business standpoint, but also it gave an internal sense of pride that these are the kind of stories that company could tell.
So this was a hard moment because I'm a freshman consultant to this creative genius Spot, and I'm watching the commercial for Super Bowl and knowing that we're going to have a conversation. This is the same organization that in their first training, my PowerPoint offended them so much creatively that they were throwing things at the screen. So I was quite tentative, but what I was thinking about most was not how the commercial was received externally, but how does this commercial reflect the organization internally? And having conversations already with staff members at Wieden+Kennedy, I knew that Spanish wasn't spoken freely by people for whom Spanish is the first language, and that we weren't reflecting and celebrating the beauty within. And so that was the first push to really bring this internally.
So another spot we want to share with you, another campaign, is for Procter & Gamble, and it's called Love Over Bias. So P&G has been doing these Thank You Mom campaigns for the last 9 years at the Olympics, and these campaigns remind us of everything that our moms do, from picking us up to taking care of all of our needs 24 hours a day. And with P&G is the largest advertiser in the world. Their brands reach 5 billion people a day. So with that, along with the Olympic platform, we felt like it was an opportunity to inspire an important conversation and to do something bigger and promote social change. So the idea was that unconscious bias affects us and our children every day, and that moms are our kids' first advocates. And the truth came from this insight that when bias rears its ugly head, mom's love will overcome. And if we could all see each other like the way a mom sees a child, the world would be a better place. So let's take a look.
Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Ooh, child, things will get brighter. Ooh, child, things are gonna get easier. Oh, child, things will get brighter. Someday we'll get it together and we'll get it all done. Someday when your head is much lighter. Someday we'll walk in the rays of our beautiful sun. Someday when the world is much brighter. Oh, child, things are gonna get easier.
Representation was huge in this work. I was the first creative who was a mom to work on this campaign in the 9 years, and my partner was the first Black creative to work in the campaign. And so together, the two of us we felt like this work was a synthesis of our personal experiences, and it became deeply personal. And we had to, as we like to say, to do the work, we really had to do the work, meaning we had to have really heartfelt, deep conversations with each other around race, gender, unconscious bias, motherhood, all of these things. And it was just a really profound experience. But we also were very intentional about how we created the work. In terms of casting, we used people who had actually experienced bias in their own lives and not just actors. We used a lot of real mom-children pairs in this spot. And then in terms of working and collaborating with partners behind the camera, we worked with women and people of color for the director, editor, crew members. So it was a very conscientious move every step of the way. And then for the musician, the woman who sang this song, she was discovered at the Women's March in DC in 2017. And she is an immigrant of Chinese American parents and had experienced bias in her own life. So yeah, she really brought her heart into it. So
a Black creative that worked alongside Patty Curvins, I introduced yesterday in the video, in talking about colorblindness. And it was this monumental place with Love Over Bias, so big that we end our foundation training now. Of 25 years, this training we've been doing all over the globe, it ends with Love Over Bias, and you absolutely have to have, a frozen heart to not feel that commercial. Right, but the big piece too, which Wieden+Kennedy and others have struggled with, is taking this entry point through race and believing that when we go through race, we actually develop a capacity to have a deeper conversation about all diversity categories. And when we exclude race, those other diversity categories don't typically take us to race. And so this piece is so incredible because not only does it portray that vivid race image at the beginning of a Black girl who doesn't have any models behind her as skiers, but it gets into the issues of disability and of LGBTQ and of all kinds of class issues. And so what a beautiful spot. And that was a lot of fun to be connected with.
Yeah. I'm conscious of time as well. And I think that this as Glenn talked about, going through the door of race and how that opens the aperture for the conversation is critical. And especially when it comes to a brand that has a platform. Patty talked about P&G being one of the largest advertisers in the world. They have a platform. Coca-Cola at the Super Bowl has a platform. Nike has a platform. As a brand, they feel that they should always represent the athlete and the athlete's voice. And so as they started to think about their 30th anniversary of Just Do It, they wanted to think about the true voice of the athlete and what did that look like and what did that sound like today. And what that meant was, and what we're hearing more and more is, athletes are telling us they are more than just an athlete. They represent more than just an athlete. And I think that was a huge part of why you'll see the work, but why the brand felt like it needed to take a stand. It needed to stand with and for the athletes that it represents. So let's take a look.
If people say your dreams are crazy, if they laugh at what you think you can do, good, stay that way. Because what non-believers fail to understand is that calling a dream crazy is not an insult, it's a compliment. Don't try to be the fastest runner in your school or the fastest in the world. Be the fastest ever. Don't picture yourself wearing OBJ's jersey. Picture OBJ wearing yours. Don't believe you have to be like anybody to be somebody. If you're born a refugee, don't let it stop you from playing for the national team. Don't become the best basketball player on the planet. Be bigger than basketball. Believe in something, even if it means sacrificing everything. When they talk about the greatest team, make sure it's your team. If you have only one hand, don't just watch football, play it at the highest level. And if you're a girl from Compton, become the greatest athlete ever. Yeah, that's more like it. So don't ask if your dreams are crazy. Ask if they're crazy enough.
This was a seminal moment, I think, for the agency, but also just as you start to think about what I said at the beginning of this brand truth and this human truth and how that connects in a sweet spot that can be communications and can tell a story. I was in Paris when this launched and I saw the newspaper. I can't speak French, but I could see that it had impacted that culture and that society. So it was fantastic. But there was definitely a nervousness. You've got to be brave to take something on like that as a client, because we can sit there and come up with ideas, but there's a bravery that it takes to really go at that, because there are at times consequences. The first 3 days of that campaign and that activity, people were burning Nikes. It was across the news. They were burning Nikes. They saw the share price drop. So there was a clear momentum and conversation that was being had in homes around America and the world. But then they saw that be responded with a conversation as to what do people believe in. And again, the bigger message that Nike had was around crazy dreams. That was just a part of that conversation, but it married the human truth with that brand truth to truly make an impact in culture.
So this work has transformed our work with organizations outside of advertising, particularly with schools and educators. And sometimes we're now showing a series of amazing works, and people go right away to, well, you know, it's Nike and capitalism and, you know, capitalism and racism, and now you're being a bit, you know. And what I like to say here is that you got to start somewhere. And what's happening with this piece and the piece with Serena under the same sort of model is that there are children who are seeing these commercials and they're seeing role models say things that need to be said. And absolutely behind it is a whole corporate machine and, capitalism and all of those things. But my belief is that these spots actually help the agency as well as help the clients, the brands, to start having a deeper conversation about racial equity and social justice.
So it's not just about a single campaign's voice that will change things. It's also about how the brand behaves. So this next work we're going to share with you is for Nike Equality. And again, it was more than just a film or print ads. Nike also supported equality by how they chose their athletes. On campus, they did a drive where they came up with their own equality agreements. They also gave time and money to different foundations that were supporting equality and Black Lives Matter, as well as they worked with schools in LA to make sure equality was coming through in sports. So it's more than just a single campaign. Let's take a look.
Is this the land history promised? Here, within these lines. Here, you're defined by your actions, not your looks or beliefs. Equality should have no boundaries. The bonds we find here should run past these lines.
Long time coming.
Opportunity should not discriminate. The ball should bounce the same for everyone. Worth should outshine color. If we can be equals here,
we can be equals everywhere.
So we've been doing this work with Glenn for 5 years now. And you can see how the story has evolved, how the agency has become more comfortable even with that conversation. And it is a courageous conversation that needs to be had. But as you start to build on that, this was, as Patty said, is just building that conversation. And I think it is so critical that we are able to take a stand and have a conversation about what's happening in our world, what's happening when it comes to racial justice, what's happening, what's with social change, how are we truly affecting it? And as part of that, we kind of talked through, as an agency, 5 agreements. And for us, it became such a big part of the conversation and the learning and the work. So Wieden+Kennedy, there is a phrase, there's lots of little bits that get said, but the main thing that you'll hear about Wieden+Kennedy as an organization is the work comes first. Creativity is held on a pedestal, is pushed up and led. So as we were doing this work, it became critical that we got to a set of agreements that we could all build upon. The first of those was really thinking about getting uncomfortable, or getting comfortable with being uncomfortable to make the work better. The premise being, your voice is your story. How do you share it to make the work better? This was a super interesting one. The third was really around hire someone different than in your team to really make the work better. Create a culture of belonging on your team. So how are we making it inclusive? How are we showing that it's diverse? How are we showing that there is an equitable relationship as we build? And how are we making that personal to make the work better? And then make room for unheard voices. Patty referenced mums, referenced Black and African American, really thinking through how we make room for underrepresented voices to make the work better. Because as an agency, the way we see it is diversity, equity, and inclusion makes the work better. That, for us, is where we now start. That's where we sit. It's very clear for us that that is a critical part, because that is, as Glenn started this conversation with, it's a personal belief, it drives our behavior, and it shows how an organization can make and affect change in the world through the work it does in a really critical way. Thank you.
Thank you.